Welcome to Researcher Desk seminar, and today Andrew Fanning will give a presentation. Andrew's research is in the field of ecological economics at the Doughnut Economic Action Lab. And with that, I leave over to Andrew.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you for having me here today. Nice to see you all and for sharing this time here together. So I will give a brief introduction of donut economics, some of the concepts and the theory that drive it, where it comes from, as well as how it's being put into practice all around the world. And so let me jump right in. I have prepared some slides, and then I'm looking forward to the discussion and questions and some time after that. So I believe you can see my screen here now.
Yes.
Great, thanks, Paul. And here we are. It's May 2026 already, which is surprising to me every day that goes by. But I think it's worth starting off with a picture of, how the 21st century has begun. And it's really begun with a series of multiple global shocks or crises that have been reverberating around the world, from the financial meltdown in 2008, 2009, that triggered a decade of austerity in many countries. We, of course, lived through the COVID lockdown with unprecedented social and health and economic consequences. We're living in an age of climate and ecological breakdown with stronger storms and the impacts being felt worldwide. And critically, I think it's important to note that the movements that have arisen, recognizing all of these, the root causes of all of these challenges very often lie within the very systems that we have constructed. And so we have movements that have given rise through Fridays for Future, of course. Many of you are sitting in Sweden, where that movement originated with Greta Thunberg, Extinction Rebellion, many others who have risen up in response to some of these challenges and where they're arising from. But at the same time, we're also seeing an increasing protest crackdown among those very activists and people who are standing up as laws get increasingly militarized or police getting stronger powers and so on. And so I think that broader context of where we're landing here today is important to note, and this is just some of the broad crises that have been felt at the global scale. But I think it's really important to emphasize that the impacts of these crises are felt differently by age, by race, by gender, across the global north, the global south, by wealth. But at the same time, they critically show us that we're interconnected so clearly with one another, as well as with the rest of the living planet. And that, as I said, these crises arise from the very systems that we have created and inherited from the 20th century. And so I think it's worth taking a start and a quick look at what some of those economic systems have been looking like. I'll start with the starting point, where if the biggest picture that you could see in economics, that I was taught at least, is this diagram on the left-hand side here. You can see it's called the circular flow diagram. And the idea is that households and businesses are connected with one another, where households provide households provide labor, businesses provide wages and goods and services, households buy those goods and services. Of course, in more complicated versions, we also have a banking sector, which takes in savings and invests in others. We have governments that tax and spend. And of course, we have trade with the rest of the world. And this model has been quite powerful. It was created in the 20th century, and it underpins many of the policy levers that we see in macroeconomics, because the whole idea is that the system should balance, right? So that if savings are not equal to investment, then you're going to go into debt. If taxes are not as high as spending, then you will be out of balance there. Imports, exports, and so on. This has been powerful, but of course, it's missing a very critical picture, which I will get into a moment, but I think many of you will probably be able to guess, is that there's no outside to this model, right? It just depicts the economy as sitting in a void. and by implicitly implying that that economy can just continue growing and growing and growing. But of course, we all know that's not the case. The economy is on our finite planet, and we are bumping up against some critical boundaries. What about the picture of how we behave in our economics? So my colleague Kate Rayworth, who wrote the book on Donut Economics, she recognized that actually there was no picture of the economic agent that's depicted in most neoclassical models. So she went about and drew him, and he's a man. He's standing alone. He has money in his hand. He has calculator in his head. He has ego in his heart, and he has the rest of the living world at his feet. And the whole idea here is that, this notion, this caricature of human behavior is practical for modeling purposes because, we believe that Homo economicus has fixed preferences. He always knows what he wants. He knows the value of everything in order to make decisions. He can never be satisfied, and so on. But of course, that picture of who we tell ourselves that we are, it actually has an influence on who we can become. And there's some fascinating research showing actually that economics students have been demonstrated to be less altruistic and more competitive in relation compared to students in other disciplines. So these behaviors can be learned and they can have an influence on, of course, how we behave. So there's how the self-portrait. And what about the goal? Now, interestingly, at the macroeconomic level, there's actually no stated goal of what an economy should do within the theory, at least. But one of them has kind of snuck in, and it's because of the assumptions that essentially, if consumption of goods and services increases people's well-being, makes them better off, then in the aggregate, you would think that if we maximize consumption, then we will be maximizing utility or well-being. And that has translated into this idea at a macroeconomic scale of increasing never-ending gross economic domestic product or economic growth as kind of the goal for our economies. And of course, that goal is one of the driving forces that I'll be speaking about throughout the course of this talk, but I believe that it's driving many of these crises that I mentioned in the previous slides, because clearly we cannot just continue growing and growing and growing and growing forever and ever. Amen. And so these are some of the big picture starting points of economics that we have inherited, and I believe it's worth putting them on the page here as we start the talk. But what about the environment? How does the environment get brought into neoclassical or mainstream economics? So economics has been described as the queen of the social sciences. And so even from the get-go, oftentimes the environment was not the core focus. Now, in microeconomics, there's this sub-discipline that's known as environmental economics, not to be confused with ecological economics. But the whole idea here, it arose from the thinking of Alfred Pigou in 1920s and has been quite influential, recognizing that this image here, many of you will be familiar with it. It's the familiar X of where supply and demand meet one another. And at that equilibrium point in mainstream economics, this is an efficient outcome. But of course, what Pigou and others recognize is that for private actors, you might actually have one equilibrium because those private actors are not assuming all of the costs, both socially and ecologically, of their production processes. So what we need to do is internalize these costs to recognize that private costs might not be the same as social costs. And so the red wedge that you can see there is this idea that of true cost accounting or internalizing the externalities as the language often goes around. Now, of course, the issue with this is, of course, we should pay the true cost of everything, but at the same time, this notion that we can value things that are not actually traded in markets, like the earth system that we depend upon, or ecosystem services, or care, or many, many aspects of our lives that are not traded in a market. have to be brought into the economy. It's even in the language. They're externalities that need to be internalized. But if you take this to its logical conclusion, then really this is kind of an economic imperialism where we need to value everything in order to behave correctly. So this is one approach. When it comes to macro, which is the whole picture of the economy, where does the environment come in? And here, as I mentioned before, it really shows up as an economic sector, so to speak, where land or resources are seen as factors of production that businesses and others mobilize in order to produce goods and services. And what's missing here, of course, is this idea that there's no such thing as a perpetual motion machine, right? That we can't have circular flow just without any energy source. And what that source of energy is, of course, is the sun for our solar energy and fossil energy as well as the Earth system for providing all of the materials that go into this, as well as assimilating all of our waste. And I'll show a picture of how we should recognize the economy as a subset of society and the Earth system in a moment. But given that if this is how we are seeing the environment in our mainstream economics, I think that there's actually like a tongue-in-cheek way of putting it is that if we had aliens on the planet that were, wanting to take over or something, they actually wouldn't even need to come here with their flying saucers or their lasers or anything. All they would need to do is just convince us that this is a representative way of depicting our relationship with the living planet that sustains us. And then really the rest would just sort of take care of itself. Now, of course, that's tongue in cheek, but I do believe we fundamentally need to transform the way that we see our relationship with the economy, with the rest of society, with the rest of the planet. And this is a diagram called the embedded economy, also drawn by Kate in Donut Economics, the book that depicts exactly that, that the economy is a subset of society, which is a subset of the earth. We're completely dependent on it, on the earth system for living matter and materials and assimilating waste. And the economy within it, if we look, we can recognize that the market is one core realm of provisioning goods and services that we need, but it's of course not the only one. We all know that there's also a state. It's almost like the 20th century boxing match. Are you free market or are you like all in for central planning? But critically, there are these other realms of provisioning, which are the household, how we show up every day. When we wake up, we don't just show up as workers. We have families, we have, loved ones and people that we share our homes with. And there's also the commons, of course. And this is where we show up not in a market type exchange, but as volunteers, as stewards, as co-creators, where again, money does not exchange hands for services, but what it is required for is enabling some minimal flows, but not in a wage labor relation. And so that's where you see financial flows going all between there. So within the society, of course, we have political, social, legal, spiritual, cultural aspects that are underpinning, how society determines a relation with the economy. And at the same time, from the Earth system, we know that the Earth needs a stable climate, thriving biodiversity, healthy oceans, cycling fresh water, nutrient cycles, and so on. So this image, I think, is a much better representation, and it's the underpinning worldview of ecological economics, the economy within society, within the Earth system. Now, if this is the big picture view, then the donut, as I'll describe here in a moment, is a way of seeing how, effectively a goal for our economic systems and for humanity. We think of it as a compass for human prosperity, where it describes the aim to meet the needs of all people within the means of the living planet. And here, if you imagine resource use radiating out from the center of this diagram, then all people, in order to meet their needs, need an essential minimum standard for food, for health, for education, for political voice, housing, energy, and so on. So we need to get everybody up and over this social foundation and into the green space of the donut here. But at the same time, we need to not use so much resources that we start destabilizing the Earth system. We start causing climate change and acidifying the oceans and, degrading ecosystems and the critical biodiversity that they house and disrupting freshwater flows and so on and so on. And the social priorities of the donut have been crowdsourced from the social priorities of the Sustainable Development Goals, and the 9 planetary boundaries that form the wedges, the dimensions of the ecological ceiling, are taken from the 9 planetary boundaries framework. And I think that it's just worth, I guess this image has been very, very compelling for me, and for many others, I think, because you can see it as a holistic kind of whole. And that if this is the goal, that we want to live in this donut-shaped space where we're meeting the needs of all within the means of the living planet, then I do believe that we can actually have a economic system that can last for, the many, many generations that are to come. Now, of course, if this is the goal, we can attach data to all of these dimensions, and we can see that clearly we have a very, very long way to go. So there are billions of people who are falling short of meeting their most essential needs on the planet, and collectively we are now overshooting at least 6 of the 9 planetary boundaries. This image was published in 2025, where we did a fairly major update of the donut. And actually, the week after we published that, the ocean acidification boundary was kind of officially crossed, according to planetary boundaries science as well. So 7 of the 9 planetary boundaries have been overshot. And that's, on the one hand, quite obviously deeply alarming. But on the other hand, it can also be seen as kind of a liberating sense, because if I see this image, what it tells me is that we need to transform everything, which actually offers an opportunity to think about how can we redesign our economic systems, our model, our business models, our government policies, and so on, so that they are fit to get into both sides of the donut at the same time, which is clearly not what the current system has been designed to achieve. Now, if we want to look at some trends over time, this recent study, it shows some improving conditions from a social perspective at the global scale, which is good news, although it's still kind of minimal, because what we're measuring with the social foundation is really deprivation, so critical deprivation. So clearly there's still far too much red in the bottom of this diagram. Well, for the ecological dimensions, what we've seen is just a deeply concerning, in my view, acceleration of overshoot beyond the planetary boundaries over the course of the 21st century. Now we know, so far I've been describing at the global level, we know that there are vast inequalities of lived experience around the world. And so we wanted to make visible by essentially looking at 3 different clusters of countries based on their income levels: the poorest 40% of countries, the middle 40% of countries, and the richest 20% of countries. And with that, we could see that very clearly those who are suffering the most deprivation are obviously living in some of the poorest countries of the world, whereas those who are responsible for a lot of the overshoot that we can see at the global scale are living in some of the richest countries of the world, including where I'm sitting right now in Spain, or you in Sweden, and most of the global north, or the rest of Western Europe. And then the middle 40% country is kind of somewhere in between, but more proportional to their middling status. And this, I think, is really important to recognize, because global pictures can mask these important inequalities, but we need to make them visible. Now, if we go down a layer deeper, in a different study published in 2022, we looked at almost 150 countries, and here are 4 of them across the range, where again, we can see Malawi, who's clearly there's a lot of red in the center of that donut, but they're not overshooting any of the fair shares of planetary boundaries that we were able to look at. Then you have China, which is partly falling short and already in overshoot. Sweden, which is similarly, from a social perspective, many of you will be aware that Sweden usually is among the top in terms of social well-being, which is something to be celebrated. But at the same time, what we see is this level of resource use beyond fair shares of planetary boundaries that simply could not be extended to all people on the planet. So Sweden is not a role model that is viable for the rest of the world at this, at least not today. And then you have the United States, which if Sweden needs to feel a bit better about its level of overshoot, you can look to the US, which has even higher levels and actually not doing quite as well from a social perspective. So deeply concerning, and you can see this spread across. Now, if you fit as many donuts on a chart, which I think this is about as well as I could do, what you can see is that there's no nation that's living in the donut. So we want to be meeting the needs of all people within the means of the living planet, which is where we would expect ourselves to be in the top left of that corner. No nation is actually there. Here's those countries I showed: Malawi, China, Sweden, the United States. And of course, before I start, we really need to remind ourselves that looking at countries as single units of analysis, we always need to remember that they're deeply interconnected with one another. So they're not just isolated entities. They're related by colonialism, military power, corporate power, the trade and finance rules that connect them, resource extraction, and the impacts of climate change, of course, which are felt first and hardest by those who have contributed the least. But if we take a look at this broad trajectory, I think it shows, and you'll see this time and again in many indicators, this trajectory of kind of diminishing returns. At low levels of resource use, we see a big improvement in terms of social performance, but beyond a point, that relationship breaks down. And that level, that point, I would argue, has long been crossed in the case of most Western European and global North countries. As you can see, Sweden, United States, well, actually, if you attach data to it, as shown here, these trajectories, as you start crossing that path, they just break down. They start going all over the place. They're just back and forth and so on, not related clearly to levels of well-being or social performance. And I think it's here I'm inspired by the words of Donella Meadows, who's a systems thinking guru expert, who reminds us to always ask, whenever we're talking about growth, it's growth of what and why and for whom and who pays the cost and how long can it last and what's the cost of the planet and how much is enough. So I think that clearly we need to turn this growth pathway around so that we don't swoosh past the donut-shaped space where we're going. But what would that look like? Well, here I think we could think of these three broad trajectories. Like the lowest income countries of the world clearly need to rise up to provide the critical provisioning infrastructure that is required to meet the needs of their residents. But what would that look like? Because it's a pathway that hasn't been followed because every previous country has overshot planetary boundaries in order to get there. So that's a new pathway. Similarly, middle income and emerging economies need to almost reorient like 90 degrees in order to continue meeting the needs of their residents while getting back within planetary boundaries, although tends to not be as much overshoot as what we see in the high income countries that just radically need to reduce their levels of resource use while at the same time maintaining or even improving the levels of well-being that are provided to their residents. All of those pathways, none of them have been done before, so they're deeply transformative. But at the same time, we also need to remember that in order for them to be achieved, we need to rebalance the global economic system and the relations that are keeping those who are poorest almost stuck in that position as a result of the core periphery relations over centuries. And some of those rebalancing things, what could they look like? Is like reparations for slavery or for appropriation of the atmospheric commons. There's the return of stolen land. There's redistributing wealth and technology, renegotiating trade and finance rules in multilateral organizations, rebalancing global institutional power. So these are, this is the kind of some of the biggest picture and trajectories of what is required in order to live within the donut. Um, Most of the what I've discussed so far has been a presentation of kind of the donut and how it can be downscaled to the level of nations and what that shows us. But of course, this book here, it's called Donut Economics: 7 Ways to Think Like a 21st Century Economist, published in 2017, written by my colleague Kate Rayworth. It lays out these 7 different ways, which I won't get into everything here, because what I'd like to do is speak a little bit more on how people who have read the book have been inspired by the concepts and are just putting them into practice in their lives. So let me jump right in here with Doughnut Economics Action Lab. What are we? This will be almost a rapid fire of just practice from our worldwide community. So we exist to support those who are trying to put these ideas into action. We work in 6 broad ways, which like thematic areas around supporting local governments, supporting communities and art, business and enterprise, schools and education, research and academia, where I am kind of leading that area, and government and policy. And I've just thrown some quick ideas, well, quick kind of facts at the bottom there. But before, I guess, from the perspective of the theme that I'm running, one of the best places to get more information is at the Research and Academia thematic page, where you can find tools for researchers, donut data portrait, which is how we don't downscale the donuts, resources for teaching. We have a research for action network, and more. So if you're interested to learn more from a research-led perspective, that's a great space. From a teaching perspective, my colleague Kate has developed this amazing set of resources diving into each of the 7 ways, called Donut Economics for University courses, which I strongly recommend. And of course, those are more in the conceptual/university space, but what would it mean to actually apply these concepts in a place? And for that, we encourage people to ask themselves this ambitious question, which is, how can our place become a home to thriving people in a thriving place while respecting the well-being of all people and the health of the whole planet? And you can see that that's a big question, but I think that it's a question that underpins so many of the challenges and opportunities that we faced in the 21st century. Now, if we want to dive into what that actually looks like of people who are picking up the tools and concepts of donut economics, this is a map showing, more than 60 local place-based networks set up by no, not universities, although universities are often involved, but usually kind of community groups in their places. There are more than 50 local government groups. Around 5 of them include both, which I think is really important in terms of holding to account, especially the government. The local networks can hold the governments to account in their place, but likewise, the local governments can have a connection with the community through the local groups too. And this is, of course, not to mention the more than 500 business initiatives or countless schools and universities who are putting the ideas into their classrooms and more. So if you want to learn more about how local governments are engaging with donut economics, this is a great guide. It is written by my colleague Leonora Gurcheva, and she's also put together recently an overview of the emerging practice in an academic article, which you can see on the screen here, but essentially laying out these 9 ways that places are getting started. Just recently, my colleague in the government and policy area, which is more national governments and international organizations, has published a report, Donut Economics for Policymakers, that takes those 7 ways, but recognizes that under the surface, in this metaphor of a tree, there are these kind of unseen levers for action around public finance and culture, operations and influence. And she's developed, I think, around 30 stories that dive into different examples of policies in action. In the business area, we've focused on enterprise design. How an enterprise is designed will really unlock the potential that it has to contribute to the regenerative and distributive future that we need. And my colleague Aaron Sahan developed more than 25 case studies of businesses, none of which are perfect. None of these examples are perfect, by the way, but ways of teasing out inspiring individuals and initiatives that are trying to create meaningful action in the ways that they can. Similarly, with sectors, there's food, there's clothing, there's highways, there's urban development. We have a guide here that dives into the different sectoral initiatives that are picking up donut economics, if you're interested in a particular sector. Now, let me just wrap up with some of the insights on why local governments are engaging with donut economics, which I think also apply to many other areas. And those are that donut economics can offer a new, broader, and more ambitious way to understand and talk about sustainability using tools and concepts for new transformative agendas that recognize an age of crisis. In that it's holistic, it unites social and ecological work, which is often siloed across different departments and different jurisdictions and so on. But it can connect councils with residents, the civil sector, businesses, and organizations. There's a strong visualization component, which is helpful for communicating, for mobilizing. It can offer new ways to measure progress by recognizing that, we have targets and we can incorporate those into our metrics, not just measure kind of over time or relative to others. And that it offers a narrative of hope and possibility where everyone has a role. You can see almost every walk of life can be envisioned within the donut. And that resonates widely with people. So let me wrap up then just by reminding ourselves that, Donut Economics, we consider ourselves part of the wider movement of new economics pushing for transformative action, whether that's a well-being economy or regenerative economy, planetary health. All of these we consider are very close allies and aligned organizations. But we need to remember that in many cases, these new economic concepts are not so new. They have been held and stewarded and protected by indigenous and many civilizations over millennia. There's a Heara Waiora in Aotearoa in New Zealand, the gross national happiness in Bhutan, Buen Vivir in Latin America, Ubuntu in Africa, and many others that recognize the core relational role of thriving in balance. And I almost think of the donut and the new economics as a Western mindset recovery program. So yeah, I'll leave it there and thank you very much. Looking forward to the rest.